Good morning to everybody, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Welcome to the SIIA and our talk on getting back into business, China's recovery from COVID-19. I think it's a very important issue. As we know, tragically, this virus started in Wuhan and has spread into a global pandemic. But there's also hope emerging from China. The way China has tackled the problem and the speed of its efforts to restart the economy are quite breathtaking. And China is big enough to really matter. Here in Singapore, it's been one development to note just this last few days, that agreement is being reached with China to restart travel for business with China in 6 different cities or provinces. And I think while we will negotiate with others when they're ready, this is a good sign of how business and economy might start to patchwork recovery the global and regional economy. So it really matters to us, and not just to Chinese in mainland, what happens in China. But while it matters so much, there is so much that is talked. Many people have different views about China even before COVID-19. And those either support or cynicism amplifies in this present situation, particularly as Sino-American tensions, which also were there before COVID-19, have really rippled up and increased in noise and distortion. It's very hard to get a real perspective. But today we have not one, but 2 speakers who are very well positioned in different ways to share with us. Bert Hofman is my think tank counterpart. I greatly respect him for his work at the East Asia Institute. Before that position, he was with the World Bank and served as the World Bank's chief representative in China itself. So he may not look Chinese, though I am, but he understands China much more deeply than I do, and I've always gained from talking to him. The second speaker is Dr. Victor Gao, currently the Vice President for the Center for China and Globalization in China, based in Beijing. And as Seraphim says, he's on a high-speed train between Guangzhou and Beijing to reach where his base is. And I would say that in a way, Victor is a person who really understands China from the very opening. On his CV and in past meetings where I've hosted him, I've always been impressed by how long his view is of China, because he started off as the official interpreter with the great Deng Xiaoping, accompanying him on many of his journeys through China and outside. And so they both will lend great depth to their readings about China below and deeper than the headlines that you might see. I want one last remark before we start. I'm amused by the different circumstances which we find our speakers. Bert, like me, is somewhere at home and somewhere in Singapore. And we are doing our best to read the global situation, the China situation, based on our analysis, based on what information we can. Victor, as we've said, is literally on a speeding train, having spent a few days in Shanghai, then in Guangzhou, and now moving back. It's a sign that China perhaps is literally on the move. So please allow me to start with Bert Hofman. Thank you, Bert, for doing this. Would you like to take us through your thoughts about the economy, taking about 10 minutes?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And even though I feel for the analogy to some extent that we're locked up and China's on a high-speed train, I think the high-speed train is working only at half speed, but I'll get to that. Look, there's no question that China, after initial fumbling of the response, which cost China dearly and the world dearly, the response to the COVID epidemic has been very forceful. And because of that, it could last relatively briefly. So the economic impact has been controlled, if you want. In addition, China has started measures, literally on the day that it locked down the economy, it started measures to alleviate some of the impact on the economy already. And there's quite a variety of that. Nevertheless, the first quarter was not good, minus 6.8% year on year. And that may look quite rosy compared to what some of the other countries are going to show for the second quarter. But nevertheless, this is the first time that China actually reported negative year-on-year quarterly numbers. So they produced numbers ever since 1994, never had a negative number, not in the Asia financial crisis, not in the global financial crisis. So this is really quite a blow to the economy, not surprisingly, because the economy was locked down. Second quarter looks better, but definitely not a return to normal. If we look at the daily indicators, you'd almost sort of say it's sort of back to 0% growth year on year, maybe a little bit positive, but there's still clear sectors that are not doing so well, especially the services sector and especially international trade. And if you want, the problem has moved from a supply side problem, locking down the economy in the first quarter, to now much more of a demand side problem. Demand from overseas, but also demand from people who have either lost their jobs or they have experienced cuts in salaries, or businesses that have closed, and businesses that are still quite uncertain about what's going to happen next. So investment demand is also down. Nevertheless, for the year as a whole, a positive growth is still entirely feasible. And we at the East Asian Institute, we believe that the second quarter is going to be something in the order of between 0 and 1%. And then the third and the fourth quarter, you'll see a recovery in earnest, in part supported by government policy, which I'll come to in a moment. And so we think a 2 to 3% growth rate is still feasible for this year, and which is remarkably good if you compare that with the rest of the world. The IMF, for the world as a whole, projected in January, they projected plus 3% growth. By the time the full impact of COVID became clear, they projected minus 3% growth. For China, the turnaround was from a projection of about 5.5% growth to now 2 to 3% growth. So the loss in growth in China is relatively modest compared to what we see in the rest of the world. Of course, the rest of the world might still surprise us on the upside as well. Part of the reason why we think that the recovery in the second half is going to be quite forceful is government policy. And we've just had the National People's Congress last week, and I'm sure all of you were glued to the TV to see Li Keqiang's speech and many conferences. But there were a couple of very remarkable things that happened. The first remarkable thing was that China did not set a growth target. And again, that was unprecedented for almost 25 years. They published a growth target. This year, they did not publish a growth target. And that was in part because it was uncertain, but in part also, as Li Keqiang said, this year is not about growth. This year is about stability. This year is about employment. This year is about keeping unemployment low. Nevertheless, if you look into the numbers, China has at least an assumption of growth. And the budget numbers imply a nominal growth, including inflation, of 5.4%. If you look at their inflation target, you can conclude that they're looking at around 2% real growth this year. How do they support that? Well, by a stimulus, and both fiscal as well as monetary. The fiscal accounts show they're a bit messy in China, and I've worked for 20 years trying to improve it, but I'm still not fully satisfied. But if you really look at it, their general government deficit, which is the most important broad indicator of deficit, will this year be around 10.5% of GDP. Now, that sounds like an awful lot, but last year it was already 5.5. So as an economist, you'd say that the fiscal stimulus from the fiscal side is about 5 percentage points of GDP. How that's done, we can talk about it, but in part it's actually support for employment, it's support for poverty reduction targets, and then it's support for infrastructure. Not so much the old style infrastructure, even though some of that is still there. There's still high-speed rails being built, even though the World Bank would probably no longer approve. but it's a lot of what they call new infrastructure, and that is 5G, it is cloud, it is artificial intelligence, it is very different, it is a high voltage transmission to get renewable energy from remote areas to the consuming areas. So a very different kind of infrastructure compared to, say, 12 years ago during the global financial crisis, when the network of high-speed rail, the network of highways was massively expanded. In addition to the fiscal side, there's a monetary side, and Premier Li, Chinese Premier Li, nicely called it prudent but flexible. But if you actually look at it, the planned credit creation is quite loose. And basically what the authorities said, it's going to be the nominal growth is going to be at least as high as 2019. But because nominal GDP growth is a lot less, it means that the monetary conditions will be quite loose. There's a final element to the policies that probably will support growth, and that is, if you want reform and opening up. In the run-up to the National People's Congress, there have been a couple of important documents on reforms, and a Central Committee document on accelerating reforms. Now, the reforms themselves, actually, they look remarkably the same as in 2013, when there was a big gathering in the third plenum of the 18-party Congress that laid out a reform agenda, basically of the Xi-Li government. But to be fair, the implementation has been lagging. I believe that with a re-announcement of those reforms, I think there is new impetus for reforms. One particular area is quite important, and that is hukou reforms. Hukou reforms combined with land reforms. And the government has now set specific targets to convert rural hukou into urban hukou. And it means that basically a lot of people are already living in urban areas but don't have the full rights in urban areas now feel urban citizens, which is good for demand on property, which is good for the land market, which is good for government revenue. So it will have quite a bit of an add-on effect. The second area of reform I think is worth pointing out, not least because we're talking to a largely Singapore audience, is a reduction in the negative list of foreign investment. So this actually now it becomes easier to invest in a number of sectors that used to be closed. We don't know which ones yet, but that's going to be announced very soon. And finally, from more of a portfolio investor point of view, already before the National People's Congress, there was an abolition of the quota for investment by qualified foreign investors. So basically, it means that on the inflow side, China opened up the capital account, which is remarkable. Now, the outflow side is still a bit of a question mark, but it's now actually much easier to buy equity and bonds in China. And it shows because what was actually remarkably stable in China were capital flows. And this is, if you want, China growing up as no longer being seen as an emerging market, as something to flee away from in times of trouble, like in Indonesia or like in Malaysia, or they got much under pressure. In China, the capital flows were relatively stable. The pricing in the treasury market, which is by far the largest chunk of the capital market, was all quite stable. So combine that with the global indices now taking a bigger part of China into their index, the capital flows may actually be quite positive this year and the coming years. So in sum, still positive growth, not as good as we used to, but positive growth supported by government policy on the fiscal side and monetary side, and hopefully also a boost from reforms. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bertie. There will be questions for you later, but just one quick one. What could go wrong with that plan? What's the one sort of risk you think?
Well, the one risk and question mark is the external front. It's no longer as important as before, but given I don't know how to characterize it, but given the different attitude from the Trump administration vis-a-vis China, and I see that very strongly connected with the election campaign ongoing in the United States, that is a big risk factor. But it's no longer as risky as before, simply because trade to GDP is no longer as important as before. It's not negligible, but it won't be the death blow for China. It will be difficult, and especially if there is a technology war rather than a trade war, it will be very difficult for China to overcome that. But I think both in terms of aggregate demand as well as in terms of capabilities, Chinese capabilities, China could overcome it. Of course, it's much better if there is no trade war, if there's no tech war. Much better for China, much better for the region. But I think we have to face reality that it will be rough weather ahead.
Thank you very much, Bert, for that introduction. Victor, would you like to tell us your views overall for 10 minutes?
Thank you very much, Simon. When I get closer to the end of the 10 minutes, let's say 1 minute left, please give me a signal or remind me, because I do not want to overspeak. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to join this very important gathering. And I'm indeed on the fast-speed train from Guangzhou to Beijing, traveling at more than 300 kilometers per hour. And this is very symbolic of where I am. China's moving along, despite of all the difficulties. I would say in the world today, there is nothing more important and more meaningful than China-US relations. And we know for sure that over the past 3 years, under repeated and continuous and increasingly intensified attack launched by President Donald Trump himself and his close advisors in the United States, China and US relations have been deteriorating. It has not yet hit the bottom, and we do not know where is the bottom. We do not know whether it will phase into another Cold War or even another hot war. The danger is very, very big right now for the China-US relations. However, Dr. Henry Kissinger is absolutely right. Besides,
Sorry, Victor.
Are very much armed to the teeth. Yes.
Victor, we lost you around the time when you said that you're not sure where the US-China relations will go, whether it be a Cold War or even a hot one. And then
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I mentioned no one knows where the bottom is. This China, as far as concerned, we do not know whether eventually it will end up with another Cold War or even armed conflict, for example. However, one thing which should give us assurance is that Dr. Henry Kissinger is absolutely right when he emphasized to the current leadership in the United States that war is not an option between China and the United States. Why? We know a very obvious reason. Both China and the United States are very much armed to the teeth in terms of the nuclear weapons. And if anyone really believes that the war between China and the United States could be very much controlled within the conventional sphere, that is very much an indulgence in fantasy. I would say the escalation will be very, very rapid between conventional war and nuclear war. So that actually gives us more assurance that because of this specter of mutually assured, as well as in Washington, should be gun shy as far as anything which may push the bilateral relations into an armed conflict, starting with conventional warfare.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that Victor at the moment is frozen. So we just have to wait for the technology. If necessary, as Seraphim said earlier, we'll have him switch over to simply a voice call. Our staff behind the scenes now, texting Victor and trying to fix this. Would you bear with us for a second?
Victor is the first victim of the Cold War. He is frozen.
Or the nuclear winter, who knows?
Let's keep it at the Cold War.
Okay. Victor, can you hear me now? We lost him entirely now. Victor?
Sorry, Simon, we're just having him reconnect.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
Hello, Victor, can you hear me now? Victor? Hello, Victor, can you hear me? Michelle, ladies and gentlemen, I propose that we, in a way, carry on conversation, just like we would in a room. Imagine if Victor had a coughing fit, we would just continue, look after him, Michelle took after him, try to get him back in the conversation. But let's continue with some of the issues and maybe pick up from, oh, Victor, you're back.
Yes, I'm back. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. You were talking about the Sino-American tensions and potential. You hoped that America would be gun shy. But in a way, if I could speed you up, not your fault, but beyond the Sino-American, are there views you have about the Chinese economy itself? Please carry on.
Yes, just now the other expert mentioned his view about Chinese economy. Yes, 10%. But I hope by the end of the year, Chinese economy for the whole year probably will grow half of the government's original target for if China really can achieve 3%, the Chinese economy, one of the best performing economies in the world. Now, I think we should take encouragement from Premier Li Keqiang's press conference the other day when he mentioned that the Chinese government and China as a whole still have lots of policy possibilities to launch continued reform in China. For example, one thing which is a very obvious state, that is the reform of the public health sector in China. We know public health sector is one of the very few sectors in China which have remained more or less unreformed for the last 40 years. And there is a lot of need and a lot of imperative for reform in this particular sector. And that will really generate a lot of productivity and increase the whole size of the Chinese GDP growth for this year and for many years to come. Now, the other thing, as Premier Li Keqiang mentioned, to maintain stability in terms of jobs is more important than purely economic growth numbers. Therefore, I think the task right now China is very much engaged in is to maintain job for as many people as possible, including, for example, there will be about 8 million college graduates for this year. And hopefully they can 跟离开的就很说，离开的那种咯。那怎么刷新呢？参与人。
We can see you, Victor. Victor, we can see you. We just can't hear you.
Okay, let me see what's wrong. Hold on.
Don't worry.
You can see.
Why don't you just carry on? You're a bit out of focus, but don't worry. We're fine. We can hear you. Please
Okay,
go ahead.
you can hear me now. Okay.
Yes, you can. It's clear.
Okay, I think for China, the top priority for this year is employment, to avoid the massive unemployment and to make sure that companies, small and medium-sized companies in particular, can continue to operate and can avoid laying off staff. That's the top priority for the government. And to achieve this goal, there are lots of things that China is doing, including, for example, giving out loans to companies to make sure that they can survive and get over through this very difficult time. And also job retraining and making sure that migrant workers, for example, will not be suddenly thrown out into the streets. And also a top priority is for the 8 million college graduates who should finish school very soon in June or July, and they should find decent jobs. Job market is very, very difficult for this year. How to overcome this big challenge is a big task for the whole country. Now, as I mentioned, China is changing very rapidly. I would say China will continue to climb up the technological ladder by innovation and creativity. And based on my own about 14 days of travel from Beijing to Shanghai to the Guangzhou area, I can assure you one thing. That is, the Chinese companies are really enterprising and moving deeper into creativity and innovation. The tech war between China and the United States will only serve to refuel this drive more and more into the technological breakthrough and try to eliminate or reduce the Chinese dependence on American technology. So eventually, whether this is really what the US government wants or not, the bifurcation of technologies between China and the United States will actually really happen. And the speed of development on the Chinese side will be much faster than foreign countries, especially the United States or Europe probably, would ever expect. So that's my view of the Chinese economic development for 2020. If I go back to the China-US relations in general, let me emphasize several very short points. One is that war should not be an option between China and the United States. Based on that, another point is very important. That is, the United States has no way of holding China down and bullying over China without impunity and without consequences. Therefore, the United States is not a factor in preventing China's continued peaceful rise. And I would say, even though China is already larger than the United States as an economy, if we use purchasing power parity, in 10 years' time, China definitely will be comprehensively larger and more impactful than the United States, including in the real exchange rate calculation of the Chinese economy. This is happening as we speak, and this is happening, and this is going to be achieved within our lifetime. And this is very, very significant as part of history we are witnessing.
Thank you, Victor. Can I ask you sort of 3 follow-up questions? One is about stability. And in a way, how are the Chinese people feeling in terms of, the government's handling? I mean, if the economy, it's quite good. It's very good compared to the rest of the world. It's quite good to COVID never happened, but it's not good. It's not as good as any time in China. Will that, in a way, diminish people's satisfaction level with the party in Xi? That's one question. The second question, in a way, is China is so big, and many of the measures are for China itself. In this recovery period, does China feel it needs the rest of the world? Not so much America, but the rest of us, Europe or BRI or ASEAN. Is it a partner, or is it going to go more, on its own, using its own money, its own technology, its own companies, its own people?
Thank you. These are two very good questions. Now, in China, what I've learned over the past 40 years is that if I compare myself with my neighbor or many of my neighbors, I will always be unhappy. But if I compare myself with myself 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I should be very, very happy. So if you say are there many people in China who are not happy? Lots of them, because their neighbors have a bigger house, have a bigger car, have their kids going to Harvard or Princeton, for example, and they are unhappy to some extent, relatively speaking. But I would say, if they really are very objective, comparing themselves with many years ago, for example, lots of the people are better off. I'm traveling through, as we speak, this vast countryside, and I would say every village I can see outside of the train window is becoming better than, for example, 10 or 20 years ago when I passed through this part of China. So I would say this year, lots of people will continue to be unhappy, but their unhappiness is measured in the sense that relative to themselves. And when they look at themselves and comparing China with many other countries in the world, they will be more objective. Now, China is very much part of the world right now. China can never close the door and withdraw back to the China market. Because if you look at how much interconnection there is between China and the rest of the world, be ASEAN, for example, or EU, and whichever part of the world you see Chinese presence, and you see the Chinese businesses making win-win business propositions with their counterparts. Now, there is only one country in the world, or should I say, there is only one misguided leadership of one country in the world, that is the United States, who is talking about disengaging with China. I personally don't think that's possible. Disengaging with China is shutting yourself out from the largest market in the world. So if President Donald Trump really achieves what he wants to achieve, that is to move manufacturing jobs back to the United States, then he will face another dilemma. That is, assume the United States will manufacture lots of goods, products. Then the US companies need to sell them somewhere. And where is the biggest market? That is the China market. So for more than 100 years, the United States has always been talking about open market, open equal opportunity for the access to the China market. I don't think walking out of China market will ever serve the real fundamental interest of the American people or of the American businesses.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor. I got more questions for you, but I think there are also some raised hands and some chat coming in. I think those of you who want to send a question by chat or the question and answer function, please do so. I will then do my best to read it out or interpret it and put it to the speaker. If you wish to indicate who is for, whether Bert Hofman from the East Asia Institute or Victor Gao in China, please let me know. I see a raised hand, and this is from my assistant director, Jessica Wau. She's the assistant director for ASEAN and has been helping me a lot in the work of ASEAN plus ASEAN Friends. So Jessica, would you go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much for the talk and to both of you. My question is on Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been a great gateway to China, mostly financially. And Mr. Bert Hofman, you described that China is opening up more. I'd like to know what happens to Hong Kong's position. And then I think more for Mr. Victor Gao, what is the effect Hong Kong's national security law has on geopolitics in the region, especially for ASEAN or Southeast Asia? Thank you.
All right. Shall we answer those, Simon, and then go on?
Yeah, I just got my mic. I kept my video off so Victor has more bandwidth. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me start on the economic side and maybe say a few things about the politics of Hong Kong. But on the economic side, even though Hong Kong still fulfills a certain function to vis-a-vis China. It's a very different function from, say, 30 years ago when I started working on China. When the size of Hong Kong relative to China has changed dramatically. At that point, it was about 25% of the greater China. Hong Kong now it is 4%. The function of a gateway, there's many gateways now in China. In those days, the Hong Kong harbor was a very important logistical hub. It is no longer so. On financing, there's many other alternatives for Chinese companies. So what is still very important is the connection of Hong Kong proper and Hong Kong's entrepreneurs with China. And they're the masters in exploiting that relationship, but that is relevant for Hong Kong. It is far less relevant for China, mainland China, and it's far less relevant for the rest of the world. So even though it is important in the political aspect and in the international relations aspect, economically, it is less important than it was before.
Victor, would you like to answer a question about Hong Kong?
Thank you very much. I would say Hong Kong was very important, is still very important, and will remain very important for mainland China. We all know that back in the early 1980s, Hong Kong, very small compared with the Chinese mainland population. Hong Kong at that time had more fixed line telephones than mainland China combined. Can you believe it? So this was, just a couple of decades ago. And indeed, Hong Kong is much smaller, much less impactful as a financial center for China. Shenzhen is very much developing, and Shanghai is very much developing. However, I think the importance of Hong Kong is really about one country, two systems. If China can handle this Hong Kong situation better, this will serve as an inspiration not only to, for example, Taiwan in the future, but many other countries in the world. Now, for the national security law for Hong Kong, as a matter of fact, ever since July the 1st, 1997, the cardinal law in Hong Kong is the basic law. Basic law contains one particular provision, that is Article 23, which says that Hong Kong ASEAN government in due time should adopt a national security law. So this was the original plan for Hong Kong since the very first day of the peaceful handover from Britain to China as far as Hong Kong sovereignty is concerned. We all know that for the past more than what happened in Hong Kong and law
Victor, we've lost you for the last 3 minutes. Okay, I think we might have
Simon,
to.
would you like to continue?
Yeah, I think we have to continue. Thank you, Michelle. But could I ask you a question about China? I mean, we talk about China recovery. Victor talked about Chinese technology, innovation. But when we look at the cities and the country is so big and it's so diverse, will that partial recovery, the half speed you talked about, be enough for the relatively poor and relatively not so advanced parts of the Chinese economy? And similarly, Victor mentioned the 8 million young people. Now, China has some fabulous universities, don't you think? But they also have some very, I would say, kind of second, third rank universities. And even before COVID-19, these people graduating from the second, third level universities struggled to find a decent job, a good job that suits a graduate. So this unevenness and plus the half speed, would it cause some economic roots of instability and questioning?
Well, whether it's a root of instability remains to be seen, but it's clear that there are very large inequalities. Even Premier Li Keqiang pointed out that, look, we may have on average something in the order of $4,500 per capita, but there's also 600 million people that only have about $1,400 per capita. So the income inequalities are quite large because of the fiscal system. That also translates into quite large inequalities in opportunities, i.e., access to education, access to healthcare, and combined with the hukou system that ties basically people to where they're born, and that's where they get their public services. So first, very important that this reform in the hukou system continues, that people can actually move to the areas where they are more productive, that's one, but also where they can put their kids into better schools and therefore get a better future for their children. Second, I do believe that 2 to 3% growth is not enough to give to meet the objectives of 6% unemployment and getting everybody out of poverty. Those are basically the big targets for this year. Now, the 6% unemployment is in a way, it's a bit of a deception because it's urban unemployment. And so it leaves out a tremendous amount of people that are the migrants in the countryside. We don't know how many of those are unemployed. There is a little bit of an illusion in China that, oh, they go back to the countryside and then they go back to become a farmer. Well, maybe a few, but frankly, people that are from the service industry, they don't go back to farming. They're just waiting for unemployment. So they're heavily underemployed. And the social safety net. The social safety net is not good in targeting those people. So it's going to be a real challenge. And these are not small numbers. I mean, numbers are floating around with anywhere between 30 and 100 million people say that are actually unemployed because of the closure, especially in the services industry. So that in that sense, the recovery is in employment is really quite partial. And there's not that much prospect to see that recover very, very quickly, simply because the services does require face-to-face contact. And for that, we'll see social distancing for quite a while, even in China, but around the world. So it's simply going to be harder to see that come fully up to speed. At the same time, I said there is a fair amount of policy attention to that, and I think what will come out is a strengthening of those safety nets. It's a strengthening. Already, Li Keqiang said, look, we're going to pay more for pensions for old people. Well, they should, because right now it's 70 yuan a month, which is, no, I mean, that's not very much. And the DBAO payment is probably going to be increased, the DBAO payment being the social welfare payments. And then the whole organization of the targeting mechanism is probably going to be improved. But it takes that to get through this year. Then in the medium term, I said the hukou reforms, the household registration reforms, improving of the social services in the countryside as well as in destination cities of many people that would want to look for urban hukou is going to be the next challenge.
Good. Thank you so much for that very full reply. I noticed you avoided the politics, but I think on economics, I learned a great deal from you. And politics, well, you know.
Economics is politics, right? So this is a very big political issue, and China has to their credit. For a long time, it already has been that the Xiaokang society is not just Xiaokang for some, it's Xiaokang for all, in an all-round manner. And Xi Jinping, from the start, it was one of his since 2015, it was one of the 3 critical battles to eradicate absolute poverty. And even in this year, this very, very difficult year, politically, the goal is still, let's eradicate poverty. And is that to prevent social unrest and other things? Well, maybe, but it's also decent policy.
But I ask you another question, which is kind of like politics and economics. Victor Gao really sort of dismissed the idea that there could be a decoupling. But at the same time, I mean, he and many of us acknowledge that there is a certain, with anger in America, and particularly Trump, to really go ahead with that sort of idea. So even though it may not make sense, they're going to try.
Hello.
Oh, hi. Sorry, we're talking about the supply chain thing that you raised. Sorry to lose you for a while. We've kind of moved on.
I apologize.
No, it's not your fault, unless you put it off deliberately. Please don't worry. But we were talking a little bit, if I could catch you up, on supply chain issues. Earlier, you had made a suggestion that it'll be next to impossible to have that decoupling. So I wanted Bert to a way to lend our view about if they try it, what could the damage be for both economies, but also for the supply chains across ASEAN and Asia?
Well, a couple of remarks, because first, it's not just Trump. Yes, the United States changed, and Trump has a much more aggressive policy towards China. But some of those issues have been playing for a long time, and in part, they've been discussed for a long time with China, and China hasn't been moving that fast. Second, what changed in China was Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping's vision of China being the leading country in the world by 2049, with a strategy to go there, and with an external mission that says we can be an example for the rest of the world, for countries that want to develop but want to retain their independence. So that's a different attitude from China that we see. And so I think and that brings us in a very difficult situation where you say, well, there's a much more optimal outcome, i.e., we're all good friends and we all behave very nicely and we have wonderful trade, but that's not the route we're on now. That's not the route we're on now. And then politics complicates things. U.S. politics complicate things, but also China. I mean, China comes out of COVID. And then puts a couple of aggressive moves in the South China Sea and other places, basically saying, oh, look, we've been so good in.
Let me draw Victor out on that, if I could, but I respect your views about China's behavior, but I would like to hear, Victor, Bert Hofman just voiced something that a lot of concern about. Some people have even used the term wolf warrior, that China is acting much more and speaking much more assertively or aggressively. I want to ask you because, as I said at the start, you were traveling with Deng Xiaoping. You worked so closely with him. And the great man had a different view about how China should approach its growth. He wanted the growth, but he wanted China to keep a low profile. Do you see do you agree this is sort of a new tone of voice from China? And what should we do?
Allow me to make a couple of points.
Please
it's not because there are and the wolves want to tear down China. That's the problem. So to have wolf warriors, that's because of the threat of the wolves. That's number one. Number two is that whether the United States like it or not, China will continue to grow. And I think in about 10 to 15 years' time, we will know for sure, and the Americans included, that China will be a larger economy than the United States. And hopefully by then, those who are so desperate in the United States to put a stop to China's continued development will change their mind, because China's continued development is more or less inevitable. I don't think there is anything that can change or stop China's peaceful development. Are we still connected?
Yes, we are. I just switched off my camera to give you more bandwidth.
Okay, thank you very much. Allow me to make another. Okay, thank you, Simon.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead. Make another opportunity, please.
I would say the major problem in the world today is because there are people, you may say many people in the United States, who have not come to terms with the prospect that eventually the United States will no longer be the largest economy in the world, and China may be the largest economy in the world. And when do you think that agitation and desperation and despair will dissipate eventually? I would say when China is indeed larger than the United States as an economy, or even when China is about 125% or so larger than that of the United States, those opposing factors in the United States will recognize and will come to terms with the reality that China is already a more larger and more impactful economy than the United States. I think so long as China is not larger than the United States, those political forces in the United States will continue to lose their sleep at night. But eventually, when China pulls through that hurdle, those opposing views will more and more become more realistic and more decent, I would say. When that will happen, it will happen in the coming 10 to 15 years.
Thank you very much, Victor. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're a bit out of time. We're coming to the end. I don't see any questions. So if I may just ask the two panelists to give us their last thoughts. I think that in a way, we should start with Bert Hofman, and maybe 1 or 2 minutes, Bert, of something you either to add something or to revisit one of the key points you've made. Bert, you're muted.
I'm trying to save bandwidth as well, so I was muted and had my video off. But so look, on the economic side, this clash between the United States and China that increasingly looks like at least a tech war and maybe slides into a Cold War is of course very hard to handle. China is very important as a market. China is also very important as an intermediate supplier. So a lot of inputs into products from the region actually come from China. So it's quite an essential input. The other way around, of course, there's large connections between ASEAN countries and the United States. So if the United States, using its extraterritorial power, starts saying, look, it's not just that our companies cannot interact with China or should not provide chips or other technologies to Chinese companies, but also you using US technology, then we have absolutely major disruption on our hand. It has come not that far, or let's say it's only a very narrow band of technologies that are currently being affected, and it is largely in the high tech chips, not all chips, but the high tech chips. But if that tendency broadens, then we could see a fairly major disruption of supply chain, no question about it. And it's pretty hard to have a contingency plan for that. And I know the Prime Minister here in Singapore said, well, look, we don't want to choose, but at some point, business will drive towards a choice, and that will reinforce the thing that Victor said, this bifurcation of technologies. And I don't know, frankly, I don't know where things will come out if that indeed happens. So that's an uncertain factor in the coming 3 to 5 years. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bert. I think that's both wise, but particularly the last part. For somebody who knows China so well to say, you're not sure, because we really are at a juncture where there's so many different things happening, and the steps in the next few months could be very critical as we see the Americans and Trump gear up for an election. Any last words? Over to you, Victor. Any last words? Victor, can you hear me? Oh dear. It's so ironic that technology is becoming a problem. I think it's the train. I should think that most lines with China as a whole should be much more stable than this. I think we'll have to forego that because I think people do have lunches to go to, etc. And with apologies to all of you, and especially to Victor Gao for joining us, but in a way suffering the technology even more than us, because he had to scramble around doing all sorts of things to try to get back on, while we just carried on talking with Bert Hofman, who is equally in his own way a great expert on China. I do feel privileged. I think, as I said, we have two very different views. We try to look more at China, and there, I think there is some agreement. The numbers there look better. The pulse there, it feels stronger than just about anywhere in the world at the moment. There was an emphasis more by Bert Hofman that though it's better than anybody else, it may not be enough for a lot of the wider goals that China has, issues it's got. So it's got a domestic plate full. I think both speakers then agreed that the next big external challenge is the external one with America and Trump's America. Now there, I think Victor was much more direct and forceful and pro-China than I would say not just Bert, but most of us would be. But it was good to hear it, because part of the reason we asked Victor to do this and suffered through the technology is we really do want to hear from people in China who have seen that long view of China and see how they think about the moment. We may not agree with them, but I think hearing their voice, as Victor has tried to do for us firsthand, is useful and very important. So I will try to connect with Victor later to thank him. And he can't probably hear us, but will you all please allow me to thank both Bert Hofman and Victor Gao for joining us today. Thank you for your time. Apologies for the technical glitches, and hope to catch you next week. Thank you.